Well, sixth graders, this is it. The end of our tour of Asia. I think we left out a few countries here and there, just south of the Caucasus and the Korean Peninsula. But we can't cover everything because we do have to move on to Australia before the end of the year. And we're going to cover one of the very interesting parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, also known as the Indochina. But we're also, in addition to that, going to cover the Philippines, Japan, and Indonesia, what I call the island nations. So we're going to start with the island nations. So let's get started there. We're going to start with the Philippines, right? Now, this is the only Christian country in Asia. It is 81% Catholic, 8% Protestant, and there are 6% Muslims living in the followers of Islam living in the Philippines. Um, it's a huge archipelago. There are over 7,000 islands in the Philippines, and 2,000 of those islands are inhabited. Now, I want to say here, since we're starting these island nations, what we mean by an island. An island, and you can put this in your definitions of features and so forth. An island is a land area that is surrounded by water. We all know that. But it's got to be above water at high tide. If the island only appears at low tide, it is not an island. All right. It's got to be present when the tide is all the way in. So um, the islands. So there's only 500 islands in the Philippines that are more than one half a square mile in size. So of those 7,000 islands, they are remarkably small, many of them, and therefore uninhabited. Now, how did the Philippines get its name? The Philippines got its name from King Philip of Spain because Spain ruled the Philippines for 333 years, from 1565 to 1898. And the United States fought a war with Spain called the Spanish-American War in the late 19th century. And in 1898, by treaty, the United States received from Spain the control over the Philippines. And the United States ruled the Philippines from 1898 to 1946. And since that time, the Philippines has been an independent nation. Um, but the United States, they're still good allies with the United States, and we have a naval base there that is a very strategic one. Now, the Philippines is on the Ring of Fire. We're going to hear a lot about the Ring of Fire in this particular talk. The Ring of Fire is that area around the Pacific Rim that where there's lots of earthquakes and volcanoes, and the Philippines is no different. There are 21 active volcanoes on the islands of the Philippines. The most dangerous is Taal, which has been responsible for over 6,000 deaths since 1754. But the most famous of the ones is Pinatubo. Pinatubo erupted in 1991. That's a picture of Pinatubo erupting right down there. It was a massive explosion, one of the largest in recent history, and so much ash went up into the upper atmosphere that the climate around the world was affected. I remember in 1991, even in the United States, there were some spectacular sunsets, like because of the ash in the atmosphere that had went across the Pacific Ocean. It even affected the United States. That ash blew across the Pacific and created some spectacular sunsets in 1991. But you can see that's just one picture of how much ash flew into the air. And that volcano erupted after several earthquakes. They're not sure whether the earthquake caused the eruption or not, but after several earthquakes in the Philippines, that mountain erupted in 1991. Then we're going to talk about Japan. All right, another large island chain, over 6,800 islands, and 430 of those islands are inhabited. One of the most iconic images you can ever get of Japan is Mount Fuji. It's become a symbol of Japan. It is actually a sacred mountain to the Shinto Buddhists. Japan is a largely Buddhist country. And there's a temple at the very top of the mountain that is visited by thousands every year. People essentially make pilgrimages up to the top of Mount Fuji, and you can see it's just the perfect picture, perfect of a mountain, that amazing conical shape, and the snow is on top and so forth. Japan also is on the Ring of Fire, and they suffered an incredible earthquake back in March 11th in 2011, it was a magnitude 9 earthquake. If you know anything about the Richter scale, that's a pretty strong earthquake. And it struck Japan. And then what followed was worse. What followed from that tsunami is from that earthquake was massive tsunamis, which caused incredible amounts of damage and also triggered a nuclear reactor accident on the northern part of Honshu in Japan. And in that earthquake, after months of trying to figure it, over 19,000 people died between the earthquake and the tsunami that struck Japan. It's also, obviously one of the major industrial nations in the Pacific, and a very wealthy nation, but its population is getting much older. Its average population is very old at this particular point. Japan's an aging country, what they would call an aging country. And then finally, Indonesia, which is the largest archipelago in the world. There are over 17,000 islands, twice that, easily twice that of Japan and the Philippines. 6,000 of those islands are inhabited. Now, if you look at the little map down below there, you'll see Java. Well, it's a little island right there. Now, 57%, there are 250 million people who live in Indonesia. 57% of them live on that small island. It only makes up 7% of the land area of all of Indonesia, and yet 57% of the people live there. Now, why would that be? Because it's a very fertile island. And even it too, Indonesia's on the ring of fire. It has 45 active volcanoes on the island, but volcanic ash is very good for soil, right? It's very good for farming. It makes for very rich farming soil. So naturally, a population would be centered on where the soil is very fertile and can feed a lot of people. Now, there is an area, Kalimantan, you see it, it's on the island of Borneo. And Kalimantan is 25% of the total land area, 1/4 of the total land area, but only 5% of the population lives there. It's a very hot and not a very pleasant place to live, by all accounts, right? Now, 87% of the population of Indonesia follows Islam, and that's a significant portion of the 250 million, and that makes it the largest Islamic population of any country on earth. And even though I thought this was kind of cool, and I remember I took this in my notes years back, that even though Indonesia is right there in the tropics, it does have glaciers. There's a picture of some of the glacial activity in the island, in the mountains of Papua. In Indonesia, and those glaciers have been shrinking at a really alarming rate in recent years. Now we're going to kind of do this whirlwind tour of the main countries of Southeast Asia, which is also known as the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. It is known as the Indo-Chinese Peninsula because Indochina, it experienced influence from both India and China. So in the 19th century, some geographers named it the Indochina Peninsula because of the influence of India and China on this area of the world. So let's take a look at this. I didn't pick this map because it highlighted Thailand. I picked it because it had all of the countries I'm talking about listed. So even though Thailand is highlighted, it is not because it is anything particularly spectacular about Thailand, although it is the wealthiest country in the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. But let's go through this. The Laos, which is a landlocked country, the only landlocked country in the Southeast Asia. It is a very poor and isolated country. 67% of the population practices Buddhism in that particular country. Buddhism is widely practiced in many parts of Southeast Asia. Myanmar is one of the poorest nations in Southeast Asia. It is, however, interestingly enough, in terms of its major resources, it has a huge area of, or huge ability to mine precious stones like rubies, jade, and sapphires. There's one area of Myanmar known as the Ruby Valley, where you can, many of the great rubies are mined there. They're also known for their hardwoods, particularly teak wood is there in Myanmar. Now, Cambodia, like Laos and Myanmar, is considered one of the world's least developed countries. They're on a special list that the United Nations put together of least developed countries. Um, and it's you can tell from what their agriculture is the key to their whole economy. There's not a very industrial economy there at all. 90% of the economy is based on agriculture, and it employs 80% of the population of the country takes part in agricultural production. So it is not a particularly developed country in industrially speaking. One that is and is emerging as an industrial nation is Vietnam. It is one of the 45th by GDP. That's gross domestic product. It produces a great deal of wealth economically in the world. It's 45th in the world by GDP. It was the country, however, where 58,000 Americans died and lost their lives between 1962 and 1973 in the Vietnam War. Right? It was a great tragedy, but America does have diplomatic relations with Vietnam now, and is an important. Vietnam is an important trading partner with the United States. Now, Thailand, we'll get to that one finally, used to be known as Siam. So if you ever wonder where Siamese cats come from, they come from Thailand. Thailand is the wealthiest nation on the Indo-Chinese peninsula and is a major exporter of electronic goods. That's what really put it economically on the map. Malaysia, you see that, the country, it also extends into parts of Borneo, Malaysia does, is rich in natural resources. And some of those natural resources include tin, a tremendous amount of tin, copper, aluminum, ore, but they also have a great deal of petroleum and natural gas. And that has made it a very strong and growing economy as well in this part of the world. And there at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula is Singapore, the famous island of Singapore, a very wealthy island nation. In fact, it has the highest percentage of millionaires in the world per its population. One out of every 6 households in Singapore, and it is an extremely densely populated country. It's got the greatest population density in the world. I think something like 22,000 per square mile. But in any case, 1 in 6 of the households in Singapore has over $1 million, at least measured in American dollars, in wealth. That's pretty significant. 1 out of every 6 1 of 6 families you meet in Singapore are going to be millionaires. And because of that, not surprisingly, it is also the most expensive city to live in the world. That it's had that record for quite some time. Now I want to cover a really interesting aspect of this region of the world, and that's called slash and burn farming. Um, this is largely practiced in areas where there's a lot of dense forest that would make it very difficult to farm, and it's also in sometimes that dense forest the soil isn't particularly good. So even though it has a really tricky sounding name, slash and burn farming, it sounds like something very bad, and many people would say it is bad. But this is widely practiced. In fact, worldwide, slash and burn farming feeds about 7% of the world's population, right? But let's see what the process is, and you'll understand why, when practiced in a responsible way, this is not a bad method of agriculture, okay? The monsoon climate is a little different. You know, the monsoon comes in India in June. It comes a little earlier to Southeast Asia. It's a different monsoon wind that hits Southeast Asia. And in January, during that dry season, when the dry season starts, they cut down an area of the forest that they are planning on farming. And sometimes if there are fruit trees already there, they'll leave those standing and so forth, but they'll leave it down to dry during the dry season. And we all know that dry wood burns better. And just before the monsoon season, like I said, that's in May, and so usually in late April, they burn the area. Okay, they burn all of that stuff they cut down, right? And this does several things. Number one, it drives away bugs. We all know bugs don't like smoke, and that drives away bugs that could be harmful to the crops later on. It removes any weeds. Burning it down removes any weeds that might, when they till the soil, cause problems for the crops to grow. And most importantly, that burning provides a burst of nutrients for the soil. It makes the soil what's called very alkaline, very good for farming. That's why the volcanoes also are very good for farming as well, because they enrich the soil. And then once they have tilled the soil, the planting is done directly into the ash-rich soil. And then the monsoon rains come in May, and that helps the crops grow, and the crop is harvested in October. And then now, and here's the important thing. They don't just continually burn off areas of forest. They will use that same field for a few years until the nutrients, the field kind of exhausts itself, and then they will allow that field to grow again. All right, and they will do the slash and burn with another region of the forest. They will cut those down and use that for farming for a few years. So they rotate their fields. They don't just continually slash and burn. So this is not really the best method of farming for a large population center or areas, but for the people, the poor people who live in Southeast Asia, this has been going on for millennia. This has been the way they have been able to feed themselves and their families. So it can be, when used, like I said, properly, it can be a very effective method of farming. So there it is. The end of our tour of Asia. It ends in Southeast Asia and the island nations. Um, I hope you enjoyed that, and you will study this one as well. We'll have a little quiz on this, and then we'll be ready to take our big Asia test. So, thank you again, guys, for listening.